Every firm faces unique risks, but there are a series of high-level risks which all financial services firms, no matter what their sector or geography, need to consider. To discuss these in detail, I'm joined by Susanna Hammond. She's Senior Regulatory Intelligence Expert for Thomson Reuters Governance, Risk and Compliance. As I said there, firms of all stripes face risks, but there are some that run through across the whole spectrum through all firms. What are they?
Absolutely. Well, there's a whole series of them, and how they impact particular firms will vary in the absolute detail, but those sorts of risks which all firms need to consider, and perhaps more importantly, show how they have considered to their regulator. It includes things like how you deal with the volume of change that is coming, complexity, which is an enormous subject and is key to how firms are regulated, suitability, the skills inherent in a firm, and then perhaps last but definitely not least is corporate governance. How does a firm show it has effective corporate governance? You
touched on two things there, the complexity of regulatory overhaul and the sheer weight of it.
Sure.
Now, nobody would argue that firms need to be overhauled and regulation has to be overhauled, but because of these two factors, people are very reluctant to dive and delve right into it, aren't they?
There's a number of factors going on. First of all, firms need to be very aware of all of the bodies that impact them. Years ago, it used to be if you were a UK firm, all you had to worry about was the UK regulator. That is simply no longer the case. If you are a UK firm, you have to worry about the UK regulator, the European regulators, the international regulators, such as the Financial Stability Board, and then also there's the international regulations such as FATCA. So you have all of those bodies you need to look at, you have to understand, you have to track. If you've got the capacity, you lobby on those changes. Added into that, there's now a whole series of really quite complicated pieces of legislation and change, which are now in the implementation phase. Now, traditionally, firms have focused very much on the front end. What's going to change? Can we influence it? Let's see what we can do. It's now shifting that balance, or making sure you have balance on both sides, to make sure you can actually implement those changes, particularly when it's not a coherent sense of implementation. US versus EU, they're not agreeing yet.
So it's a minefield. I mean, if you're a large company, you've got operations in the States and in Europe, and you're getting these conflicting advice, shall we say, conflicting regulations,
yep.
What do you do?
What you do is you make your own determination. And the best advice firms can take is you make your own determination with reasoned arguments based on your best knowledge of the legislation, and then tell, not ask, tell all of the regulators concerned that this is your interpretation, this is how you are planning to comply. If they've got a problem, start talking to them now.
So you shift the onus back onto the regulators almost?
To the extent you possibly can. It is never going to be completely fail-safe, and regulators will shift their opinion. But as a firm, in practical reality, you do the very best you can. You show you have taken all of the conflicting rules into consideration. You show why this is your appropriate course of action. You can evidence it, show us where it's been discussed at the board, and then tell regulators.
Is there a sense that we may have missed the boat? I'm talking about financial regulation here, but this would apply to other sectors as well. After the crisis, there was a real will, determination and need for regulatory overhaul and reform. We kind of have missed that boat, haven't we? Or is that too simplistic?
Well, I think we've missed the boat in the sense of coherent global regulatory reform. What we're very much seeing now is, whilst at the very, very highest level, there is a sense we must get better at regulating, say, derivatives. However, how that getting better at regulating derivatives is actually being interpreted on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis is now beginning to diverge really quite widely. You've got Europe with EMIR and MIFID, and to a certain extent AIFMD, going in one direction, and whilst Dodd-Frank in the US is not the opposite direction, it's not precisely the same direction either. So you have firms treading that sort of wobbly path in the middle, trying to keep both masters happy because they're regulated by both of them.
As you say, these processes take a long time,
yes,
to put it mildly. Tell us about the example of HSBC, for example. I mean, that individual case took years.
It did, and the investigation there took a very long time. I mean, for HSBC, I mean, they were very publicly fined for anti-money laundering and sanctions failings in the US, but that was very much based on a US Senate report investigation, which took years and probably, to be frank, cost millions to do. And that was a very closely investigated 300-plus page fact-dense report looking at exactly why HSBC's complexity had got out of kilter with its risk and control infrastructure. I mean, complexity in and of itself is not a bad thing, but you have to be able to manage it. You have to have line of sight to the underlying risks. And you have to have
people at the top, at board level, who understand those complexities, and that's something that we haven't always seen.
No, and if you are somebody at the board level whose skill set perhaps is not suitably rich in risk management understanding, you are now vulnerable as never before. Regulators, no matter where in the world they are looking to senior managers on an individual basis. I mean, boards are now being looked at on both a collective liability for the sort of big picture corporate governance, but it is individual senior managers and board members who are now more than ever going to be personally liable.
And do you think that's a good thing?
I think it's a very good thing. It's the only way firms will change.
If effective corporate governance is, as we're discussing, is a core competency, how can they best demonstrate that?
This is not a one-size-fits-all concept. I mean, and good corporate governance is one of those things where it is the qualitativeness of it, not quants. It's not, 2 + 2 = 4. It's how do you evidence good risk management in action? I mean, one very practical example is for the minutes of your board meeting. It's no longer good enough just to say X was discussed and it was agreed, full stop. Those minutes should show the discussion had, the risks factors that were considered, the challenges, the criticisms, the sorts of things that previously were never really aired, must be not only transparent but evidenced. And then you can take that to your regulator when they ask those questions. This is how corporate governance works in this firm. This is how these risks were considered.
OK, Susanna, thank you very much. That was Susanna Hammond of Thomson Reuters GRC. And for more information on this topic, see Governance, Risk and Compliance Solutions at axelis.com. I'm Jamie McGeever. This is Reuters.